are you doing these days about this Corona era? I know you are so busy and it's hard to manage your works and scrambling to do your tasks. So
Yeah.
what are you doing these days?
Well, as educators, we live in the same condition, more or less. If the institutions, the schools, decided to go on with the distance education programs, so apparently it gets harder than before. Because managing the design process, especially if you are instructing a design course, it's quite hard, because usually the conversation between the instructor and the students used to be a kind of face-to-face relationship, and it's a kind of trial and error process, and that's why you should sit on the same table usually. But now we are experiencing another communication process on which you have to deal with the process in a virtual domain. So it has both, I think, advantages and at the same time handicaps. So pros and cons. We have to, I think, in future, we have to create maybe a kind of hybrid system to get benefit from this distance learning as well, maybe. So I'm quite open-minded about this new and positivistic about this new how do you say way to deal with design education, actually.
Yeah, I believe in, we need the inference structure, and there's no anything powerful in our country, and we are pretended to act in the virtual communication, everything is classic. We are pretended to be normal, standard way. Okay, if you monitor us, we had 2 interviews before. With the first one was with Albert Kiefer about urban sketch principles and the role of color in perception, and then next was with Stephen Travers and about the process of the urban sketch. And also our challenge and my audience's challenge is turn to the academical version, like the designing and something like that. So we changed the flank from the artistic to the technical interview. And I think this is much needs about the students and anyone who was in university and it's majored architecture, urban design, urban planner, or industrial design also, to think about the basic of the design and the first points of the design. So we are trying to talk about this. I must inform my audiences that Dr. Çalişkan is Associate Professor in Middle East Technical University in Ankara in Turkey, and also he has an urban design expert and urbanism studies from Delft University in PhD degree, and also he is so suitable for our subject. And we have 25 minutes, about 20 minutes to interview, and after that 15 minutes to ask questions. Please have this emphasize on the asking questions. Don't put your question on a comment line. Ask questions using the question icon beneath your display, and by this way I see your notification and maybe I don't miss any questions. So for first questions about our subject related to the visual thinking and design thinking and the role of sketch in it. This subject is so complex for audiences or students' perception that is first the first point about this kind of thinking. And the problem is how we can start one design if you are architect or urban designer or industrial designer. So for first questions, what's your definition about the visual thinking or explanation about that? Please tell us about the nature and differences between the elements.
Thank you very much. I have to first set my own position in this discussion, let's say. Actually, the main title was Urban Sketchers or something like that, but to be honest, I don't call myself an urban sketcher. It's too much for me. The people like yourself or who has a skill to represent the built up environment on the site, I think should be called urban sketcher. But as a researcher who has been interested in design thinking for the last about 10 years, I always tend to associate the domain of design thinking and visual thinking together. You know, design thinking first, then the subtitle. The subtitle was design thinking and visual thinking. Before coming to your point, the point is that design thinking is a kind of research domain, deals with the main the operations of human mind during design process. You know, conjecturing, abstraction, classification, reasoning, judgment, selection, and so on. So visual thinking should be one part of that. In each and every reasoning processes, for sure, visual thinking is involved, but visual thinking is a one selective, you know, focus area of design thinking in general. For the ones who will be interested in those topics, I mean, design procedures, cognition, and so on, I would suggest that book, Peter Rowe's design thinking books, dated in 1987, which is considered for many the Bible of design thinking. And in that beautiful book, Peter Rowe also argues about use of drawing and visualization in the cognition of the general cognition of design. So what about visual thinking? Before focusing on the use of visual thinking in design, we should first, I think, define the visual thinking in a cognitive manner. What I mean by cognition, it's not a rocket science term, it's the mental processes of human mind, basically. So in general, the agreed model is that the human brain has two hemispheres. So the right hemisphere and left one. The right hemisphere, while left hemisphere goes for logical thinking, algorithmic thinking mostly, the right one is so keen on analogy, not the logic, you know, in general. It's a very broad generalization, but it's a paradigm, you know. While the left one is keen on calculation and programming and planning, the right one is for imagination. While left one is analytical, the right one is synthetic. That means while left one is verbal, much more verbal, the right one is much more visual. So visual thinking is usually specified or specialized in the right hemisphere of our brain. So why this diversity? Because different faculties of human mind, human cognition, actually operationalize human in his or her own social life, in problem-solving processes and socialization, so on, in everywhere, in each and every domain of life. So putting in that way, we can contrast that visual thinking with verbal thinking or mathematical thinking that much. So the point is that this is the cognitive part. What about the philosophical part? Usually, in early Greeks, basically they distrust the senses. All right, that's why the philosophy of idealism has been emerged in that a level of abstraction. You know, thinking about thinking was the source of philosophical thinking in early Greeks. So an abstraction, let's say. So they didn't distrust the senses, except vision. So they see the direct vision as the first and utmost source of wisdom, you know, to getting knowledge from the world, to acquire the knowledge of the existing world and to come up with something ideal, that transcendental knowledge as well. The vision, the image itself was the source of their comprehension of the world. So this is important. So for Aristotle, for instance, he says the soul never thinks without an image. So this is very important, I think, premise.
I can show you to audiences some figures to, and you're keeping your speaking. I can show the this one to, sorry, no, this one. If they have informed on this, you said about the properties of the brain and the left and right one. Yeah. The perception is operating in that parts of the brain and imagery, and also the perception imagery as a design. We have the parts like the from the eye to seeing, and we always retain all of the images to analyzing. And also in this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and the frontal cortex is the duty to recall or synesthesia of the designing. So I think this is so useful if take a look on this image, that we have the parts that control the hand movement and the head movement, and also the sources of the imaginary things. So keep your sorry, please keep on.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm not a cognitive scientist, but we should make sure that all these kind of discussions in design thinking is based on this domain knowledge. So yeah, this is important. So we are talking about the philosophy, and I mentioned a quotation from Aristotle. Aristotle is quite well known with his early empiricist thoughts as well. And unlike the Plato's idealism, let's say, I'm not sure that it should be called empirical, but anyway, Aristotle says the soul never thinks without an image. This is a very important quotation. Just take it, the soul as self, the individual mind. So in that sense, image is quite a very key, and vision is quite a key act and concept in the Western intellectual world a lot. So when we look at the language, for instance, I don't know about the other Western languages, but in English, whenever you want to express your comprehension, if you want to state that you understand the phenomenon discussed or set forth, so you say, I see, so seeing is an act of visioning, is a very source of understanding the information processing in our mind. So it's not even etymologically, this is quite innate within Western thinking, the image itself, I think. So scientifically, it's also interesting. For instance, Einstein suggests a very, very parallel thoughts about this as well. He says, words or language, written or spoken, seems to play no part at my thought process. This is very interesting. And when we look at his own experimentation to come up with the relativity theory, for instance, he didn't deal with the concepts, but he dealt with the images. Imagination. So he imagined the possible realities. Then again, it turned out into be a kind of a paradigm itself. So there is a very beautiful documentary film called Einstein's Big Idea. I strongly suggest to our audience. In this documentary film, it's beautifully depicted how his intellectual process evolved through imagination. All right. So
if you don't join the subject together, because I have a question about this, and you must separate the question. Sorry about that. I must show you some thing like this. If you can you see this? The first thing is idea. You said in idea. The idea where is it coming? and where is the first point of the idea. I think in our majors, like the urban designers, also in architecture, and also in calligraphers and anything else like this, we have three part of the points that is coming from the challenge, the mind subject, the demands. Also, you must have noticed on the challenge. If the architect has challenge about the, for example, the one things is coming from the owner. The owner hired the architect to do something, to design something. This challenge is coming from the one guy. But about the urban project, is coming from the bunch of peoples, and we have another scales. So if we said this idea is coming from the context, or this is a concept, or this is a pattern from the paradigm. So it is. Do you think it is related to the our memories, or our something that we train in academical versions? Which one is the best explanation about that?
Well, there are hundreds of different models and schemes. I had also in my own research too, in PhD. But the point is that the relevant ones which responds to the existing paradigm, design thinking paradigm, does not differ the idea from the image itself. This is very important. So as much as I see, the model, the procedural model that you suggested does not completely respond to that point, actually. So I would like to come to this point, the visual thinking then, all right? What is visual thinking in design? So in one of the Bibles in this, on this subject, Rudolf Arnheim's visual thinking, dated in 1969, though it gets old, quite old as a source. So it has still many relevant points about the cognitive psychology of design, all right, in general. He also deals with arts, visual perception, and in art, and also, but in this book, he claims that we think with images, not with concepts. If you suggest that you first come up with the kind of idea as concept, free from the image itself, so I put a very big question mark on that. Not only for because of Rudolf Arnheim's claim or argumentation, but also in terms of my own research and the existing research on that topic as well. So it says, thinking is purely a physiological occupation of brain. Thought needs shape, you know. This is very important because we always think that we think with concepts. But he says concepts are the abstracted images. So whatever come to our mind as concepts, they has a very specific connotation, visual connotation in mind. So each and every information processing actually is a kind of transformation of those images in relation to each other. So putting in that way, we can, I think, come up with the idea of visual thinking in design a little bit. So in that sense, sketching and drawing comes to forth to discuss a little bit more. It's your main interest, I think, right? As urban sketcher.
I think this is the tools, you know, these are the tools of the visual.
Right. This was the general, you know, framework that we set in the visual thinking. Then we can focus on design, right? Designers are a kind of, you know, pragmatic animals. They want to come up with something new and novel, all right? So drawing for them is not just to represent an existing reality, to come up with something new. They research what is yet to come, all right? So they create their own reality, basically. How? Mainly by sketching, you know? Because sketching, unlike drawing, which is a picture or diagram, you know, made by a pen or pencil, or unlike painting, it's as a kind of art of paint in a picture. Sketching is something else. Sketches is a kind of rough and unfinished drawing. All right,
Yeah.
whether in urban sketch or in design sketch. Why this is rough? Because it suggests a kind of very unpredictable and open-ended interpretation possibility to do something more. That's why it's simple, rough, and vague. And we said designers are pragmatic. This is so correct, and they use sketching not for representing something, but to devise their thoughts. The information formulated in their design process. So it's a kind of instrument for them to also to store the information for their short-term memories. All right. When designing, we don't have to keep everything in our minds, and to transform them into something else without putting them on the paper. So paper becomes a kind of media, or sketch becomes a kind of medium to express our short-term memories, which are all temporal, which are all ephemeral. In turn, they turn into a kind of a detailed, concrete, and metric representation of something which is yet to become. All right. So drawing is much more representational in that sense, but sketching is referential. It refers something in a very vague way. So drawing comes after sketching. That's why. And you can classify drawings as design drawings,
another subject,
presentation drawings, visionary drawings, as we can talk about that later. But before sketching, also we have doodling. Doodling is a kind of very free-minded, traveling of the lines and points, whatever, without thinking about the purposeful activity of design. So it's unpurposeful, but it's really, I think, instrumental, useful to increase the brain and hand coordination very well. Maybe this will be your question. What would you suggest to students? Later on, we can discuss about it.
I have the medium question about this. You said it's a medium about the sketch, and the illustration was from the brain, and we are expressing something in our brain in the paper for example, the owner or something else. So can I say this is true about this? If I say we can improve or empower our visual thinking quality if we see more, if we see everything more, or imagine everything is more. If I see a movie like the Inception, the Christopher Nolan Inception, is it useful for my visual thinking?
Yeah, sure. But more than the power of imagination, I think the faculty of observation is much more important. I would like to come up this point, and I would like to relate urban sketchers, the act of urban sketchers, with urban design as well. But before that, may I say something more about design process, which is quite innate, within the act of drawing. All right.
So my next question is this: about the process. So keep it on.
Yeah. All right. So I'm in the correct point to discuss. So design and drawing is quite a very how do you say, very inseparable, very well integrated acts. So then again, etymology. Design is also correlated or connoted to the term, the Italian term disegno. So disegno means drawing. So when we look at the etymological evolution of the concept, we see that the root act, the source act, is drawing to define design. Actually, historically, this also implies the emergence of the profession of designer as well. So, you know, with Renaissance, design becomes a kind of profession after craftsmen. So unlike craftsmen who experiment the act of the object, the product, the industrial product directly, designers put an in-between domain, a medium between the idea and the product. All right. So drawing becomes a kind of intellectual product of the designers. All right. Instead of the product itself. And they don't experiment with the object directly, but they experiment with the representation of it. All right. So in that sense, drawing becomes a very, very core act of design, let's say. So what is the role of designing in design process? Another common, very common paradigm is that design is a kind of self-reflective profession, as argued by Donald Schoen. And accordingly, design does not come up with a certain, you know, eureka moment. Doesn't come from scratch, from a blue sky, but it evolves from a very seed-like, a very primitive ideas. All right, step by step, gradually, and in an evolutionary way. It means the first fuzzy, vague, and uncertain image put on the paper, a sketch, is always subject to be transformed by means of self-reflection. You reflect your own thinking, you know, you reflect what you have already done and putting on the paper. So in that sense, that's why the sketch is always ready to evolve into a metric quality representation. So such a progressive transformation is always subject to be developed with metric qualities, measurable qualities. The first image of the sketch is non-metric. It's just topological or impressionist, whatever.
It's like Richard Rogers about the George Pompidou Center. Yeah. And we have the good sample about this, what I think about this. You're talking about the first things. This is George Pompidou, the first sketch from Richard Rogers. And after that, it's turned to, if anyone know that, this is Richard Rogers one, and the George Pompidou Center. And after it's changed to the another generation of the drawings, and it's turned to the plan. And so this is the first point. This is important that the students must have consider about the first things. They know they have the complexity to design that we must draw something elaborately in the best question. This is the first things that Richard Rogers draw about the George Pompidou. Please keep on.
Well, actually, this is what I completely about talk about design as a profession. And when the products get larger in scale and get more complex, then they need a designer, all right, instead of the direct maker. So unlike mason, unlike blacksmith or any craftsman, designer had to represent the complex relationships in a more technological buildings, more complex spatial structures, more complex cities, settlements, campuses, whatever, and that's why they need designer. So then designer needs some alternative representations, as you show.